The dust cloud rose behind the convoy of sheriff's vehicles as they rolled down the dirt road toward Jacob Running Bear's ranch that morning in March 2024. 5 patrol cars, 2 livestock trailers, and a county assessor's van, all there to seize 300 head of cattle grazing on what the state claimed was public land. Jacob stood at his gate, weathered hands gripping a leather folder that held documents older than the county itself. His great-grandfather had warned him this day would come. The question that would shake the entire state government wasn't whether Jacob would surrender his herd. It was what secret those papers contained that would make armed officers turn their vehicles around and leave empty-handed. Before we reveal what stopped them cold, tell us in the comments. Where are you watching from today? Sheriff Tom Brennan stepped out of his vehicle with the confidence of a man who had executed hundreds of seizure orders. He had the law on his side, or so he believed. The county had declared Jacob's grazing land as illegally occupied public territory, demanding immediate removal of all livestock and payment of fines totaling $75,000. Jacob had ignored 3 certified letters, 2 court summons, and 4 personal visits from deputies. This was the final step. Brennan adjusted his hat and walked toward the fence line where Jacob waited, expecting the usual protest, maybe some shouting, perhaps even resistance. What he didn't expect was for Jacob to calmly hand him a folder and say 5 words that would change everything. This land was never yours. The morning sun beat down on the high plains as Sheriff Brennan opened the folder. Inside were documents that looked like they belonged in a museum, not a rancher's hands. The paper was yellowed with age, the ink faded but still legible. Official seals pressed into wax marked each page. Brennan's expression shifted from confidence to confusion as he scanned the first document. It was written in English, but the formal language of the mid-19th century made it difficult to parse quickly. He called over the county assessor, Martha Chen, who had brought her own stack of modern land surveys and ownership records. Together they stood at the fence, reading words written 174 years earlier, words that directly contradicted everything their office computers claimed about this property. Jacob Running Bear was the 5th generation of his family to work this land. His great-great-grandfather, Chief White Eagle, had negotiated directly with territorial officials before Montana was even a state. The ranch sprawled across 12,000 acres of rolling grassland, bounded by the Yellowstone River to the south and the Musselshell River to the north. It wasn't the largest ranch in the county, but it was one of the oldest, continuously operated by the same family. Jacob's cattle grazed the same trails their ancestors had walked for generations. To him, this wasn't just property. It was sacred trust passed down through blood and promise. The state saw it differently. According to their records, this land had been transferred to public ownership in 1967 through a complex series of transactions that Jacob's grandfather supposedly agreed to. The dispute had been building for 3 years. It started when a new county administration took office and began aggressive reassessment of land ownership throughout the region. Their goal was to reclaim what they called improperly privatized public lands and generate revenue through grazing fees and lease programs. Jacob's ranch fell directly in their crosshairs. The county's case seemed airtight. They had deeds, surveys, and legal opinions from 2 different law firms confirming the land belonged to the state. Jacob's protests were dismissed as the complaints of someone trying to avoid paying what they owed. The county filed suit, won a default judgment when Jacob refused to appear in court, claiming the court had no jurisdiction, and today's seizure order was the enforcement action. It should have been routine. Sheriff Brennan looked up from the documents, his face pale. He pulled out his radio and spoke quietly to dispatch, requesting legal counsel to come to the scene immediately. Martha Chen was already on her phone, scrolling through digital archives and cross-referencing claim numbers. Something was very wrong. The documents Jacob had provided weren't just old land deeds or bill of sale papers. They were treaty documents signed by Territorial Governor Isaac Stevens himself, predating Montana's statehood by 17 years. The papers outlined specific boundaries, water rights, and grazing territories granted in perpetuity to the Assiniboine people represented by Chief White Eagle. But there was something more, something that made Martha's hands shake as she zoomed in on one particular clause buried in the middle pages. The treaty specified payment terms. In exchange for the Assiniboine people ceding millions of acres to the expanding United States, the government promised annual payments of goods, livestock, and cash totaling $50,000, a fortune in 1850 money. The payments were to continue for 20 years, ensuring the tribe could transition to reservation life with adequate resources. But according to the treaty records Jacob possessed, including signed receipts and correspondence from Indian agents, the government had made exactly 4 payments before ceasing altogether in 1854. The remaining 16 years of promised compensation, $800,000 in period value, potentially worth tens of millions today, were never paid. And according to the treaty's explicit language, failure to complete payment meant the land cession was void. The government had been operating for 170 years on territory it never actually purchased. Jacob's great-grandfather had been a meticulous record-keeper. He had preserved every document, every receipt, every piece of correspondence with territorial and federal officials. When the reservation system was imposed, White Eagle had negotiated a special arrangement. His family could remain on a portion of their traditional land as long as they maintained the treaty documents and continued the relationship in good faith. Generations of running bears had protected these papers, storing them in waterproof containers, making careful copies, updating inventories. They watched as the government pretended the treaties didn't exist as settlers moved in, as the state was formed and counties organized. Through it all, they kept their proof, waiting for the day someone would try to take what was rightfully theirs. That day had finally arrived, and Jacob was prepared. Sheriff Brennan closed the folder carefully and handed it back to Jacob. He radioed his officers to stand down from the seizure operation. Martha Chen was already making calls to the state attorney general's office, her voice tense as she explained what they had found. The other deputies gathered around, sensing something significant was happening, but not understanding what. One of them asked Brennan if they were proceeding with the confiscation. The sheriff shook his head slowly, unable to articulate the magnitude of what he had just read. This wasn't a simple property dispute anymore. This was a legal bomb that could unravel land ownership claims across the entire region, potentially affecting thousands of properties and billions of dollars in assessed value. The implications were staggering. As the sheriff's convoy prepared to leave, Brennan approached Jacob one more time. He asked where the original documents were stored, suggesting they might be safer in county archives. Jacob smiled for the first time that morning and pointed to his ranch house on the hill. They were in a climate-controlled safe, he explained, along with certified copies already distributed to 3 different law firms in Washington, D.C., Seattle, and Denver. If anything happened to him or his family, those firms had instructions to immediately file suit in federal court. Brennan nodded slowly, understanding he was dealing with someone who had planned for every contingency. This rancher wasn't some angry property owner making desperate claims. He was the guardian of historical truth that powerful people had worked for generations to bury, and now that truth was coming to light. The history of Jacob Running Bear's land began long before any treaties were signed, back when the Assiniboine people moved freely across the northern plains following buffalo herds and seasonal camps. For thousands of years, the territory along the convergence of the Yellowstone and Musselshell rivers had been prime hunting and gathering ground. The rivers provided water, fish, and transportation routes. The surrounding grasslands supported vast herds of buffalo, elk, and antelope. The Assiniboine had established semi-permanent camps in the region, returning each year during specific seasons to harvest resources and trade with neighboring tribes. When white explorers first arrived in the early 1800s, they encountered a sophisticated society with clear territorial boundaries, complex trade networks, and established governance systems. These weren't wandering nomads. They were organized nations with specific relationships to specific lands. Chief White Eagle was born in 1823, during a period of enormous change for the Assiniboine people. The fur trade was transforming indigenous economies, and conflicts with the expanding United States were becoming inevitable. White Eagle was educated by Jesuit missionaries who had established missions in the region, learning to read and write English while also mastering traditional Assiniboine knowledge and spirituality. This dual education made him uniquely qualified to navigate negotiations with American officials who viewed literacy and Christianity as signs of civilization worthy of respect. By his mid-20s, White Eagle was recognized as a leader among his people, chosen to represent them in crucial discussions about their future as American expansion pushed ever westward across the plains. His intelligence and diplomatic skills would prove essential. The Treaty of 1850 was negotiated in Fort Benton, a growing trading post on the Missouri River. Territorial Governor Isaac Stevens had been tasked by President Millard Fillmore with securing land cessions from indigenous peoples to facilitate white settlement and establish territorial governance. Stevens was known for aggressive negotiating tactics, often presenting treaties as fait accompli rather than actual negotiations. But White Eagle proved a formidable opponent at the negotiating table. He arrived with detailed maps showing Assiniboine territorial claims, documentation of previous broken promises by American officials, and a clear understanding of what his people needed to survive the transition being forced upon them. Stevens had expected quick capitulation. Instead, he faced weeks of intense negotiations that resulted in one of the most detailed and specific treaties of the era. The treaty granted the United States government access to approximately 3 million acres of Assiniboine territory for settlement and development. In exchange, the government promised several things. First, annual payments totaling $50,000 for 20 years, to be delivered in a combination of livestock, farming equipment, food supplies, and cash. Second, protection from harassment by white settlers and other tribes. Third, the right for Assiniboine people to continue hunting and fishing in the ceded territory alongside settlers. Fourth, and most importantly, specific family allotments where Assiniboine individuals could establish permanent homesteads with full property rights recognized by American law. White Eagle negotiated one such allotment for his family, 12,000 acres along the river convergence where his people had camped for generations. The treaty language was explicit and unambiguous. The first 4 years after treaty signing went reasonably well. The government made its promised payments in 1850, 1851, 1852, and 1853. White Eagle's family received 500 breeding cattle, 24 horses, farming tools, seeds, and $3,000 in cash. They began establishing permanent structures on their allotment, building corrals and irrigation systems. White Eagle kept meticulous records of every transaction, having each government payment documented with signed receipts from Indian agents. He sensed even then that paper evidence would be crucial. His instincts proved correct. In 1854, the promised payment didn't arrive. Indian agent Thomas Morrison sent a letter explaining temporary budgetary issues, promising the payment would resume the following year. It never did. 1855 brought no payment, nor did 1856, 57, or any year thereafter. White Eagle spent years writing letters to territorial officials, federal agents, and even members of Congress. His education and literacy gave him tools most indigenous leaders lacked, but they proved insufficient against bureaucratic indifference and deliberate neglect. The government had what it wanted, access to 3 million acres, and enforcing the payment terms required political will that simply didn't exist. By 1864, Montana Territory was formed, and new officials claimed no responsibility for treaties signed by previous territorial governors. When White Eagle produced his treaty documents, he was told they were outdated, superseded by new arrangements no longer applicable, but the treaty language included no expiration date and no clause allowing unilateral cancellation. By the government's own legal framework, the treaty remained binding until all payment terms were fulfilled. The 1860s and 70s brought enormous pressure on remaining Assiniboine communities. The buffalo were being systematically exterminated. Gold rushes brought floods of white settlers, and military campaigns pushed indigenous peoples onto increasingly smaller reservations. White Eagle faced a choice: abandon his allotment and move to the reservation being established 200 miles north, or remain on his land and face potential violence from settlers who saw indigenous people as obstacles to progress. He chose to stay, but he adapted his strategy. He began operating his allotment like a conventional ranch, hiring both Assiniboine and white laborers, selling cattle at market prices, and presenting himself as a successful rancher rather than an indigenous leader. The strategy worked. He became respected in local business communities, though always facing undercurrents of racism and suspicion. When Montana achieved statehood in 1889, new land surveys began cataloging property ownership under state law. White Eagle presented his treaty documents to county officials, requesting formal recognition of his allotment as family property. The officials were perplexed. Treaties were federal matters outside their jurisdiction, yet the land clearly fell within county boundaries. After months of legal confusion, a compromise emerged. White Eagle's allotment would be registered as private property under his name, with the treaty documents filed as supporting evidence. This seemed like victory, official recognition of his family's rights. But it also began a process of bureaucratic transformation. Over subsequent decades, as property records were transferred from handwritten ledgers to typed documents to digital databases, the treaty basis of the ownership became footnotes, then disappeared entirely. By the 1960s, county records showed only that the Running Bear family owned the property, with no mention of treaty rights or government obligations. Jacob's grandfather, Samuel Running Bear, first noticed the discrepancy in 1965 when the county sent a notice about property tax reassessment. The letter referenced the property as having been purchased from federal land sales in 1923, which Samuel knew was false. The land had never been for sale because it was allotment property. He went to the county offices to correct the record, bringing the treaty documents his grandfather had preserved. The county clerk, a young woman new to the job, looked at the yellowed papers with skepticism. "These look very old," she said. "Are you sure they're still valid?" Samuel tried to explain treaty law, perpetual obligations, unpaid debts spanning a century. The clerk suggested he consult a lawyer. Samuel left feeling uneasy, sensing that foundational truths his family had always known were being questioned by people who didn't understand or care about history. The 1970s and 80s passed with increasing tension between the Running Bear family and county administration. Property taxes rose steadily, based on assessments that treated the ranch as conventional private property subject to market valuations rather than treaty allotment with special legal status. Samuel paid the taxes under protest, filing formal objections each year that were routinely dismissed. When he died in 1992, the ranch passed to his son Marcus, Jacob's father. Marcus continued the protest tradition, but he also added something new. He hired a lawyer specializing in indigenous treaty rights to formally document the family's claims. The lawyer, Amanda Winters, was shocked by what she found. The treaty was ironclad. The government's payment failure was documented, and the legal implications were enormous. She prepared a comprehensive legal brief and sent copies to the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the Department of Interior, and Montana's congressional delegation. She received polite acknowledgement letters and nothing more. The government wasn't going to voluntarily admit it had been operating on stolen land for over a century. If you're enjoying this discovery and want to see how this legal battle unfolds, hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next when the government realizes they can't hide from history anymore. Marcus Running Bear died unexpectedly in 2007 from a heart attack while working in the South pasture. Jacob, then 29 years old, inherited not just the ranch but the weight of generations fighting to preserve their family's truth. Among his father's personal effects, Jacob found filing cabinets full of correspondence with government agencies, legal briefs that had gone nowhere, and newspaper clippings documenting similar treaty disputes across the country. Most importantly, he found detailed instructions his father had written: protect the original documents at all costs, never surrender the land regardless of pressure, and wait for the right moment when the government's position would be weakest. That moment, Marcus had written, would come when they tried to physically take what wasn't theirs. Then the documents would have maximum impact. Jacob spent his first years as ranch owner educating himself on treaty law, indigenous rights, and property litigation. He reached out to Amanda Winters, now a senior attorney at a prominent Seattle firm specializing in indigenous land claims. She remembered his father's case vividly and agreed to represent the family pro bono, believing their claim had enormous precedent-setting potential. Together, they developed a strategy: document everything, maintain perfect records of all interactions with county officials, and most crucially, force the government to act first. If the Running Bear family sued preemptively, they would face endless procedural delays and jurisdictional arguments. But if the government attempted seizure, they could assert their treaty rights as an immediate defense with emergency motions requiring rapid judicial response. They were setting a legal trap. The county's aggressive land reclamation program under the new administration played perfectly into Jacob's hands. When county assessors first contacted him in 2021 claiming his ranch occupied public land, Jacob responded minimally, providing no information that might help them build their case. He ignored their letters requesting documentation of ownership, skipped their mandatory meetings, and refused to acknowledge their authority. To the county, this looked like stonewalling from someone who knew they had no legitimate claim. In reality, Jacob was letting them commit themselves to a position they couldn't retreat from. Every ignored summons, every unanswered letter, pushed the county further toward aggressive enforcement action. They took his silence as weakness. It was calculation. The county's legal case relied on a 1967 transaction, supposedly signed by Jacob's grandfather, Samuel. According to county records, Samuel had sold the property to the federal government for $1, transferring it to public domain as part of a federal land conservation program. The sale document bore what appeared to be Samuel's signature and a notary seal. The county had submitted this document as primary evidence in their court filings, confident it proved their ownership claim. But Jacob knew something the county didn't. His grandfather had never signed any such document. Samuel's detailed journals from 1967 made no mention of any land sale. More importantly, Samuel's actual signature looked nothing like the one on the county's document. The county had built their entire case on a forgery. Amanda Winters commissioned forensic document analysis comparing the signature on the 1967 sale paper with authenticated examples of Samuel Running Bear's signature from the same period. The forensic examiner's report was damning. The signatures were written by different people, with distinct pressure patterns, letter formations, and pen angles. The notary seal was authentic, but notary records from that year showed the official in question had been disciplined multiple times for notarizing documents without proper identification of signers. Someone had forged Samuel's signature, possibly a corrupt county official trying to quietly transfer indigenous-held property to public ownership. The forgery had sat in county files for decades, unchallenged, becoming accepted as legitimate through sheer bureaucratic inertia. Until now. Beyond the forgery, Amanda discovered something even more significant in federal archives: the government's own admission of unpaid treaty obligations. In 1973, the Indian Claims Commission had conducted comprehensive reviews of all 19th-century treaties to calculate outstanding debts. The Commission's report included a specific line item for the Treaty of 1850 with the Assiniboine, noting 16 years of unpaid obligations totaling $800,000 in period value. The report recommended payment with interest, which by 1973 calculations would have been approximately $8 million. Congress had received the report, held hearings, and then quietly shelved it without action. But the document existed in official archives. Government acknowledgement that they owed money and had never paid. This wasn't Jacob's family making claims, it was the government admitting its own debt. Jacob's strategy of forcing the county to act first proved brilliant when they filed for seizure in late 2023. The county claimed immediate action was necessary to prevent continued illegal use of public resources, requesting emergency orders without standard notification periods. They argued Jacob was a bad faith actor who had demonstrated contempt for legal process by ignoring their communications. The judge, influenced by the county's sense of urgency, granted the seizure order with minimal review. This meant the county had committed themselves publicly and formally to the position that they owned the land, and Jacob had no legitimate claim. They had eliminated any possibility of quiet compromise or behind-the-scenes negotiation. When Jacob presented his treaty documents, it would be in the most public, most legally binding context possible. The morning of the attempted seizure, Amanda Winters was on standby in Seattle, ready to file emergency motions the moment Jacob confirmed the sheriff had arrived. She had prepared comprehensive filings for a federal district court, including the treaty documents, forensic analysis of the forged signature, the Indian Claims Commission report, and declarations from 3 prominent legal historians confirming the treaty's continuing validity. Her strategy was to immediately remove the case from county jurisdiction by asserting federal question jurisdiction. The supremacy clause of the Constitution gives treaties the same legal weight as federal law, superseding state and local regulations. The moment the sheriff tried to enforce a state court order against federally protected treaty rights, the case became a constitutional matter requiring federal court review. The county had walked into a jurisdictional trap. When Sheriff Brennan radioed his office that morning saying the seizure was being suspended, the county attorney's office initially responded with disbelief. They had a valid court order, they insisted, and the sheriff was obligated to enforce it. But when Brennan described the treaty documents and mentioned the government's unpaid obligations, alarm bells started ringing. The county attorney, David Patterson, had enough legal experience to recognize they might be facing something far beyond a simple property dispute. He immediately contacted the state attorney general's office, which contacted the Federal Bureau of Indian Affairs, which contacted the Department of Interior's office of the solicitor. Within hours, the case had escalated from a county property seizure to a matter requiring coordinated federal-state response. Multiple agencies began pulling files, searching for anything that might contradict Jacob's claims. What government researchers found as they dug through archives was that Jacob Running Bear's case wasn't unique. It was part of a pattern repeated across the American West. Dozens of treaties from the 1840s through 1880s contained similar payment terms that were partially or completely unfulfilled. In many cases, indigenous families had been removed from allotment lands through various mechanisms: forced sales, bureaucratic manipulations, or simple violent dispossession. But some families, like the Running Bears, had managed to hold on through careful documentation and strategic resistance. If Jacob's case succeeded, it could open the door to dozens or hundreds of similar claims, potentially affecting millions of acres of land currently considered public or private property. The financial liability alone could reach into the billions. This was why previous claims had been quietly suppressed or settled without precedent. Jacob was threatening to blow open the entire system. Within 72 hours of the failed seizure attempt, Jacob received calls from 5 different government agencies: the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the Montana Attorney General's Office, the U.S. Department of Justice, the Department of Interior, and, surprisingly, the Department of Treasury. Each agency wanted to discuss his claims, understand his documentation, and explore possible resolutions. The Treasury's involvement puzzled him until their representative explained, if the government acknowledged its unpaid debt from the Treaty of 1850, calculating interest over 170 years would require Treasury approval for any settlement payment. They were getting ahead of potential financial liability. Jacob listened politely to each call and referred everyone to Amanda Winters. He had learned from his father and grandfather that direct engagement with government officials rarely ended well for indigenous claimants. Amanda coordinated a meeting in Helena, Montana's capital, bringing together representatives from all interested agencies. The government side arrived with 17 people: attorneys, historians, land management specialists, and political advisors. Amanda came alone with Jacob, carrying 2 briefcases full of documents. The government's lead negotiator, Assistant U.S. Attorney Margaret Reynolds, opened with a predictable gambit. She acknowledged the treaty documents appeared authentic, but questioned whether they still had legal force after such extended time. Hadn't the doctrine of laches, unreasonable delay in asserting rights, made the claims stale? Amanda smiled and pulled out a Supreme Court decision from 1983 explicitly stating, "Treaty rights don't expire, and laches doesn't apply to federal obligations to indigenous peoples." Reynolds nodded slowly, recognizing she was facing a prepared opponent. The meeting lasted 6 hours as government researchers presented various arguments for why Jacob's claims might be invalid. They suggested the land had been subsequently purchased through other mechanisms, that allotment policies had been superseded by reservation systems, that statehood had altered territorial treaty obligations. Amanda methodically demolished each argument with case law, treaty language, and historical documentation. The room's atmosphere shifted from adversarial to something approaching resignation as government attorneys realized they had no solid legal ground. The treaty was valid, the payment terms were unfulfilled, and the language specifically stated that non-payment voided the land cession. By the government's own legal framework, it had been operating on land it didn't actually own for over a century. The question wasn't whether Jacob had a claim, but what the government was willing to do about it. Margaret Reynolds called for a recess and gathered her team in an adjacent conference room. Through the walls, Jacob could hear raised voices and intense discussion. When they returned, Reynolds' expression had changed from skeptical to pragmatic. She made an offer. The government would recognize Jacob's ownership of the 12,000-acre allotment, drop all county claims, and pay $250,000 to settle any outstanding grievances. In exchange, Jacob would agree that this settlement fulfilled all treaty obligations and prevented future claims based on the 1850 treaty. Amanda didn't even need to consult Jacob before responding. The offer was insultingly inadequate. The government owed $800,000 in 1850 value, which with proper interest calculation exceeded $20 million in current dollars. Moreover, Jacob wasn't interested in settling. He wanted public acknowledgement of the government's breach and legal precedent protecting treaty rights. The government's concern about precedent was palpable in the room. If they acknowledged owing $20 million to one family under one treaty, similar calculations would apply to dozens of other treaties with unpaid obligations. The potential total liability could exceed $1 billion, possibly much more. But more threatening than money was the land question. If treaty payment failures voided land cessions, vast territories currently held as federal land, state parks, or private property might actually still belong to indigenous nations. The implications could reshape property ownership across the entire western United States. Reynolds stated this explicitly. The government couldn't acknowledge Jacob's full claim without creating legal chaos. Amanda's response was simple. That wasn't Jacob's problem. The government had created this situation through its own breach of faith. Resolving the consequences was their responsibility. Over the following weeks, the government adopted multiple strategies simultaneously. Publicly, they maintained that Jacob's claims were being reviewed, but emphasized the complex legal questions involved, signaling they weren't rushing to any acknowledgement. Privately, they pressured Amanda's law firm through various channels, suggesting federal contract work might be affected, questioning the firm's decision to take such an inflammatory case pro bono, implying political consequences. The firm's managing partners called Amanda into a tense meeting to discuss the case. But Amanda had anticipated this and already secured agreement from two other prominent firms to take over representation if her firm backed down. She told her partner she was prepared to leave the firm rather than abandon the case. Faced with losing a senior attorney and the negative publicity that would generate, the firm backed down. Simultaneously, local pressure intensified on Jacob. County commissioners held public meetings discussing the case, framing it as one man's selfish attempt to claim public resources at taxpayer expense. Local newspaper editorials questioned whether ancient treaties should override modern land management needs. Jacob received anonymous threatening letters, his cattle were harassed by unknown parties, and he discovered surveyor stakes on his property suggesting someone was planning development despite the ongoing dispute. The message was clear: drop the claim or face escalating consequences. But Jacob's resolve only hardened. His great-great-grandfather had negotiated in good faith, kept his word, and been betrayed. 4 generations had protected the truth for exactly this moment. He wasn't going to surrender now, regardless of pressure. The case took an unexpected turn when Amanda filed in federal district court in Billings, not seeking money damages but requesting a declaratory judgment, a court order simply stating that the Treaty of 1850 remained valid and binding, and that the government's failure to complete payment meant the land cession was void. This was brilliant legal strategy. A declaratory judgment doesn't require the government to do anything immediately. It just establishes legal reality. But once a court declares the treaty valid and the land cession void, that declaration becomes precedent affecting all similar situations. The government would be forced to either accept the judgment, opening the door to countless similar claims, or appeal and risk having an appellate court affirm the principle even more strongly. Either way, the issue would receive extensive public attention and judicial scrutiny the government had successfully avoided for over a century. Federal Judge Patricia Morales, a Barack Obama appointee with a reputation for careful legal analysis, was assigned the case. She scheduled a preliminary hearing for July 2024 to address the government's inevitable motion to dismiss. The government argued that federal courts lacked jurisdiction, that the case presented non-justiciable political questions better left to Congress, and that the passage of time made meaningful judicial review impossible. Amanda countered that federal courts had clear jurisdiction over treaty disputes, that property rights were quintessentially judicial questions, and that the government couldn't benefit from its own delay in addressing obligations. Judge Morales listened carefully to both sides, asked penetrating questions about the treaty language and payment history, and took the motions under advisement. Legal observers noted her questions suggested sympathy for Jacob's position, particularly when she asked government attorneys why the United States should be allowed to breach contracts simply because it had gotten away with it for a long time. The hearing attracted significant media attention, the first time Jacob's case became national news. Indigenous rights organizations recognized the precedent-setting potential and filed amicus briefs supporting Jacob's position. Environmental groups were divided. Some supported indigenous land rights, while others worried about implications for public land conservation. Property rights organizations filed briefs supporting the government, fearing that recognizing old treaty claims could destabilize modern land markets. The case was becoming a flashpoint for larger debates about historical justice, property rights, and the continuing legal weight of 19th-century agreements. Jacob found himself giving interviews to major newspapers and television networks, finally able to tell his family's story to audiences who had never heard of the Treaty of 1850, or understood how systematically the government had violated its promises. Public opinion began shifting as people learned the details of the case. Judge Patricia Morales spent 3 months reviewing the case before issuing her ruling on the motion to dismiss. Her clerks had conducted extensive research into 19th-century treaty law, examining dozens of similar cases and their outcomes. What they discovered troubled them. There was clear Supreme Court precedent establishing that treaties remained valid indefinitely and that the government could be held accountable for breaches. Yet there was also a pattern of lower courts finding technical reasons to avoid addressing treaty claims on their merits, particularly when those claims threatened to disrupt established property arrangements. The law clearly supported Jacob Running Bear's position, but acknowledging that fact would have enormous consequences that judges historically had been reluctant to trigger. Morales faced a fundamental choice: follow the law wherever it led, or find a procedural escape route. On October 15, 2024, Judge Morales issued a 73-page opinion that shocked both sides. She denied the government's motion to dismiss, finding that federal courts had clear jurisdiction over treaty disputes and that Jacob's claims were justiciable. More significantly, her opinion included extensive analysis of the Treaty of 1850, finding that its language was unambiguous. Payment was a condition precedent to valid land cession, and failure to complete payment voided the transfer. She wrote that allowing the government to benefit from its own breach would violate fundamental principles of contract law and constitutional treaty obligations. The ruling didn't yet declare the land cession void. That would require full trial proceedings, but it established that Jacob had stated a valid legal claim that deserved judicial consideration. The case would proceed. The government's response was immediate and aggressive. The Department of Justice filed for interlocutory appeal, asking the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals to review Judge Morales's decision before trial proceedings continued. They argued that the issues were too significant to wait for a final judgment, and that forcing the government to proceed through a full trial would waste judicial resources if the appellate court eventually sided with their jurisdictional arguments. Amanda opposed the interlocutory appeal, noting that the government was simply trying to delay proceedings and avoid the public scrutiny that a trial would bring. Judge Morales agreed with Amanda, denying the government's request and ordering both sides to begin discovery. The message was clear. This case would be decided on its merits, not buried in procedural delays. Discovery proved devastating for the government's position. Under court order, federal agencies had to produce all documents related to the Treaty of 1850 and subsequent dealings with the Running Bear family. What emerged was a paper trail of deliberate neglect and bureaucratic manipulation. Internal Bureau of Indian Affairs memos from the 1890s discussed the problem of families like the Running Bears who had maintained their allotments and refused to relocate to reservations. Various officials had proposed schemes to encourage their departure or find legal mechanisms to transfer their property to public ownership. The 1967 forged signature on the land sale document appeared to be part of a systematic effort by county officials, possibly in coordination with federal agents, to quietly eliminate indigenous property holdings that complicated modern land management. More damaging were documents from the 1970s showing that government attorneys had explicitly discussed the unpaid obligations under multiple treaties, including the Treaty of 1850. The documents revealed that officials knew they were legally vulnerable on these claims but calculated that indigenous families lacked resources to pursue lengthy litigation. One particularly callous memo from a Department of Interior attorney stated that maintaining the fiction of legitimate ownership was preferable to acknowledging treaty breaches, because opening that door invites claims we cannot possibly satisfy without massive appropriations Congress would never approve. The government had knowingly perpetuated a fraud for decades, betting that silence and bureaucratic obstruction would outlast the memories and determination of the families they had wronged. They had underestimated the Running Bear family's commitment to truth. As discovery documents became public through court filings, media coverage intensified dramatically. Indigenous rights organizations held protests outside federal buildings in multiple cities, demanding comprehensive review of all treaty obligations and payment of outstanding debts. Several members of Congress, particularly those from states with significant indigenous populations, began calling for hearings on the broader issue of unfulfilled treaty promises. The case was no longer just about one family's land. It had become a symbol of historical injustice and ongoing governmental bad faith toward indigenous peoples. Public opinion polls showed growing support for Jacob's position, with nearly 60% of respondents agreeing that the government should honor its treaty obligations regardless of how much time had passed. The political calculus was shifting. The government's negotiation posture changed accordingly. In January 2025, Margaret Reynolds contacted Amanda with a substantially improved offer: full recognition of Jacob's ownership of the 12,000 acres, payment of $5 million to settle all claims, and a formal governmental acknowledgement that the Treaty of 1850 had not been fully honored. Additionally, the government offered to establish a commission to review similar treaty payment failures and make recommendations to Congress for comprehensive resolution. It was a significant offer, addressing many of Jacob's concerns and potentially creating mechanisms to help other families in similar situations. Amanda presented the offer to Jacob, noting that accepting it would provide certainty and substantial compensation while contributing to systemic reform. Pursuing the case to judgment remained risky despite their strong position. Jacob considered the offer carefully, discussing it with his extended family and with elders from the Assiniboine community. The money was substantial, far more than the ranch generated in years of operation. The governmental acknowledgement would vindicate his family's generations-long struggle. The review commission might help others facing similar situations. These were real, tangible benefits. But accepting the settlement meant dropping the request for declaratory judgment, the legal precedent that could protect indigenous treaty rights going forward. It meant allowing the government to resolve this case quietly without a judicial ruling that could be cited by other claimants. Jacob's great-grandfather had preserved the documents not just to protect his family's land, but to prove that the government had systematically violated its promises. Taking a settlement, even a generous one, felt like accepting payment for silence. After 2 weeks of deliberation, Jacob declined the settlement offer. His decision stunned government negotiators who believed they had made an offer too good to refuse. Jacob explained his reasoning in a public statement that was widely covered by national media. His family had never been motivated primarily by money. They wanted justice, truth, and legal recognition that treaties meant something more than promises the government could ignore when convenient. He quoted his great-great-grandfather's words, preserved in family journals. "We keep our word. They must keep theirs." The case would proceed to trial, and Jacob would seek a judicial declaration that the government had breached the treaty and that consequences flowed from that breach. The government had one last chance to do the right thing before a court potentially forced their hand. They chose to fight. The trial was scheduled for June 2025 in Billings Federal Courthouse. Both sides assembled formidable legal teams and expert witnesses. The government retained 3 prominent historians to testify about treaty interpretation in the 1850s, arguing that payment terms were aspirational rather than mandatory, and that both parties understood these were subject to appropriations processes. Amanda countered with her own historical experts who analyzed the treaty's specific language, showing that payment was clearly a condition of the land cession, not a separate obligation. She also planned to call expert witnesses on contract law, indigenous sovereignty, and property rights. The trial was expected to last 3 weeks, with potentially hundreds of documents and dozens of witnesses. Media organizations requested special access to cover what was being called the most significant indigenous rights case in decades. The first day of trial, June 9, 2025, brought over 200 people to the federal courthouse in Billings. The courtroom's public gallery filled immediately with indigenous community members, environmental activists, property rights advocates, journalists, and curious citizens. Overflow crowds gathered outside, watching proceedings on screens set up by news organizations. Jacob arrived with Amanda and several family members, including his elderly mother who had driven from the reservation specifically to witness this moment. She carried a photograph of her grandfather, Samuel, wanting him present in spirit. Across the aisle, The government's legal team arranged stacks of binders and multiple laptops projecting the image of overwhelming preparation. Judge Morales took the bench promptly at 9 a.m., surveyed the packed courtroom, and warned that she would tolerate no disruptions during what promised to be lengthy and complex proceedings. Amanda's opening statement lasted 90 minutes, walking the jury through 5 generations of Running Bear family history. She displayed enlarged photographs of Chief White Eagle, the original treaty documents with their official seals, payment receipts from 1850 through 1853, and correspondence showing White Eagle's increasingly desperate attempts to get government officials to honor their obligations. She explained how the government had made 4 payments and then simply stopped, offering no explanation, no apology, no remedy. She showed the jury the 1973 Indian Claims Commission report where the government itself acknowledged the unpaid debt. Her presentation was methodical and powerful, building an overwhelming case that the government had knowingly breached its treaty obligations and then covered up that breach for over a century. Several jurors took extensive notes, clearly engaged by the historical narrative. The government's opening statement, delivered by Margaret Reynolds, took a different approach. She didn't contest the historical facts. The treaty existed, payments had stopped, the debt remained unpaid. Instead, she argued about legal interpretation and practical consequences. Treaties from the 1850s, she claimed, must be understood in their historical context where indigenous peoples were being incorporated into American society and traditional territorial claims were being transformed into new legal arrangements. The payment terms were part of that transition, important but not fundamental conditions of the land cession. Moreover, she argued, over a century of settled expectations had grown up around current land ownership arrangements. Thousands of people had bought property, built homes, and established lives based on the understanding that the land had been legitimately transferred. Disrupting all that, based on technical arguments about long-ago payment schedules, would create chaos without serving justice. The first week of testimony focused on authenticating historical documents and establishing the treaty's negotiation context. Amanda called Dr. Robert Whitehorse, a historian from the University of Montana who specialized in 19th-century indigenous government relations. Dr. Whitehorse had reviewed the Treaty of 1850 extensively and testified that it was unusually detailed and specific for its era, reflecting Chief White Eagle's sophistication as a negotiator. The payment terms were clearly stated as conditions of the land cession, using language like "in consideration of" and "contingent upon" that established them as essential elements of the agreement, not optional add-ons. Under cross-examination, government attorneys tried to suggest that such language was standard boilerplate that didn't necessarily mean what it literally said. Dr. Whitehorse firmly rejected this, noting that treaty language was carefully negotiated and had specific legal meanings that both parties understood. The government called its own historical expert, Dr. Ellen Morrison from Georgetown University, who argued for a more flexible interpretation of treaty obligations. She testified that federal payment promises in treaties were always subject to congressional appropriations, and that indigenous leaders understood they couldn't enforce payments if Congress didn't allocate funds. The government couldn't be held in breach for failing to do something constitutionally outside its executive branch control. This argument had surface plausibility, but Amanda demolished it on cross-examination. She had Dr. Morrison read aloud from congressional appropriations records showing that funds for treaty payments had been allocated in 1854 and subsequent years. The money existed. It simply wasn't paid to the Assiniboine. The government's breach wasn't about congressional budgets, it was about deliberate non-payment despite available funds. Dr. Morrison struggled to explain this discrepancy, significantly damaging the government's historical defense. Week 2 brought testimony about the 1967 forged signature and subsequent bureaucratic manipulations. Amanda called the forensic document examiner who had analyzed Samuel Running Bear's signature, walking the jury through detailed comparisons showing conclusively that someone else had signed the land sale document. She then called a retired county clerk who had worked in the assessor's office during the 1960s and remembered the pressure from federal officials to clean up indigenous land holdings. The clerk, now in her 80s, testified that she had been uncomfortable with some of the transactions processed during that era, but had no authority to question superiors. Her testimony was devastating, showing a pattern of coordination between county and federal officials to eliminate indigenous property rights through procedural manipulation. Several jurors appeared visibly disturbed by these revelations. The government's defense against the forgery allegations focused on procedural technicalities. They argued that even if the 1967 transaction was invalid, numerous subsequent property assessments and tax levies had been processed against the land, and Jacob's ancestors had paid those taxes without protesting the underlying ownership transfer. This created, they claimed, implied acceptance of the government's ownership. Amanda countered by producing Samuel Running Bear's detailed journals showing he had protested constantly, filing written objections with every tax payment. The objections had been ignored, but they existed, documenting persistent rejection of the government's ownership claims. Moreover, she argued, paying taxes under protest to avoid property seizure couldn't reasonably be interpreted as accepting the legitimacy of those taxes. The government was essentially claiming that victims of fraud had to allow property seizure or else their payment of illegitimate taxes legitimized the fraud. The argument was absurd. The emotional high point of the trial came when Jacob himself took the stand. Amanda walked him through his family's history, the weight of responsibility he felt carrying forward his ancestors' struggle, and his reasons for rejecting the government's settlement offers. Jacob spoke calmly but passionately about what the land meant to his family. Not just economic value but spiritual connection, historical continuity, and proof that indigenous peoples had not simply vanished or surrendered as dominant historical narratives suggested. He explained that accepting a settlement would have been betraying everyone who had preserved the documents and maintained the claim through generations of pressure and hardship. His testimony lasted 4 hours, and by its end, several people in the courtroom gallery were openly crying. Even Judge Morales appeared moved, though she maintained judicial composure. The government's cross-examination of Jacob attempted to portray him as stubborn and unreasonable, someone prioritizing abstract principles over practical solutions. Margaret Reynolds pressed him on why he had rejected $5 million and the promise of systematic reform. Wasn't that better than risking everything on judicial decision that might go against him? Jacob's response was devastating in its simplicity. His great-great-grandfather had been promised $50,000 a year for 20 years, and the government had paid only 4 years. The debt was real, the breach was clear, and accepting less than full acknowledgement meant accepting that governments could break their word with impunity. If treaties didn't mean anything, he asked Reynolds directly, why should anyone trust any promise the government makes? The question hung in the courtroom without answer. Reynolds moved on to other topics, but the damage was done. Jacob had reframed the case from technical property dispute to fundamental question of governmental integrity. Week 3 focused on remedy questions. If the court found for Jacob, what should the consequences be? Amanda argued for her requested declaratory judgment plus monetary damages calculated from the unpaid treaty obligations with interest. Her financial expert testified that $800,000 in 1854, invested conservatively and compounding over 170 years, would today be worth approximately $23 million. The government's financial expert disputed the calculation methodology but agreed the amount would be substantial, likely in the tens of millions. Beyond money, Amanda requested the court formally declare the land cession void, establishing precedent that could protect other indigenous families facing similar situations. This was the remedy that most frightened government attorneys, as it could trigger cascading challenges to land ownership throughout the western United States. The stakes had never been clearer. What would you do if you discovered your property rights were based on a broken promise from over a century ago? Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit that like button if you're rooting for justice, and make sure you're subscribed with notifications on because the verdict in this case could change everything we thought we knew about land ownership in America. Judge Morales took 2 weeks to deliberate after closing arguments concluded on June 27th. During that time, speculation ran rampant across legal circles and indigenous communities about which way she would rule. Conservative legal analysts predicted she would find a narrow technical reason to dismiss the case, unwilling to open the door to potentially thousands of similar claims. Progressive commentators argued the law was clearly on Jacob's side, and that Morales had demonstrated sympathy for his position throughout the trial. Indigenous rights advocates organized prayer vigils and support gatherings, understanding that this case could become a turning point in the long struggle for treaty enforcement. The waiting was agonizing for everyone involved, but especially for Jacob, who had staked his entire life and his family's legacy on this moment. On July 14, 2025, Judge Morales issued her ruling. The opinion ran 147 pages, meticulously analyzing every argument and piece of evidence presented during the 3-week trial. Her conclusion was unambiguous. The United States government had breached the Treaty of 1850 by failing to make the required payments beyond the first 4 years. That breach was material and went to the essence of the agreement. Under established contract law principles and Supreme Court treaty jurisprudence, the government's failure to fulfill its payment obligations meant the land cession dependent on those payments was void. The 12,000 acres allocated to Chief White Eagle's family had never legally transferred to government ownership. Jacob Running Bear was the rightful owner, holding title that predated and superseded any subsequent governmental claims. It was a complete victory. But Judge Morales went further. She addressed the government's argument about settled expectations and practical consequences, writing that while she sympathized with concerns about disrupting modern property arrangements, courts could not refuse to enforce valid legal claims simply because violation had persisted for a long time. To do so would incentivize governmental breach and reward delay tactics. The government had created this situation through its own bad faith. Resolving the consequences was its responsibility, not an excuse to avoid accountability. She noted that her ruling applied specifically to the Running Bear family's allotment and did not automatically void all land transfers under the Treaty of 1850. Each situation would need individual assessment. But she made clear that treaty payment failures could not be ignored when individuals came forward with documented claims and proof of continuing ownership efforts. Regarding remedies, Judge Morales ordered the county to immediately cease all claims against Jacob's property and to formally recognize his ownership in all official records. She ordered the federal government to pay Jacob $21 million, representing the unpaid treaty obligations with compound interest calculated conservatively. She also ordered the government to issue a formal public apology acknowledging its breach of the treaty and its subsequent efforts to cover up that breach. Finally, and most significantly for broader implications, she issued the declaratory judgment Amanda had requested, a formal court declaration that the Treaty of 1850 remained valid and binding, and that governmental failure to fulfill payment obligations voided land cessions contingent on those payments. This declaration would serve as binding precedent in future cases involving similar circumstances. Jacob had won everything he asked for. The reaction to Judge Morales's ruling split sharply along ideological and regional lines. Indigenous communities celebrated with gatherings, traditional ceremonies, and expressions of gratitude to the Running Bear family for their perseverance. Legal scholars who specialized in indigenous rights called it one of the most important judicial decisions in decades, potentially opening the door to long-overdue accountability for treaty violations. Environmental and social justice organizations largely praised the decision as recognizing historical wrongs and establishing that governmental obligations cannot simply be ignored. But property rights groups, Western state governors, and conservative legal foundations expressed alarm. They warned that the precedent could destabilize land ownership across multiple states, create billions in governmental liability, and trigger endless litigation. Several organizations announced plans to support the government's appeal. The federal government filed notice of appeal within 48 hours of Judge Morales' ruling, automatically staying enforcement of the monetary judgment and declaratory relief pending appellate review. The case would go to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals in San Francisco, where a 3-judge panel would review Judge Morales' legal conclusions. The appeal process would likely take 18 months to 2 years, meaning final resolution remained distant despite the trial victory. Amanda had anticipated this and was already preparing appellate briefs. She felt confident in their position. Judge Morales' opinion was thorough, well-reasoned, and grounded in solid legal precedent. But appeals were inherently uncertain, and there was always risk that an appellate court might find some technical ground to reverse or limit the ruling. The fight was far from over. Meanwhile, the broader impact of the case began manifesting across the country. Within weeks of Judge Morales' decision, attorneys representing indigenous families in Montana, Wyoming, North Dakota, and South Dakota filed lawsuits based on other treaties with unfulfilled payment obligations. Each case had unique facts, but all cited Judge Morales' ruling as authority for the principle that treaty breaches voided land cessions. The wave of litigation that government attorneys had feared was beginning. Federal agencies scrambled to conduct comprehensive reviews of 19th-century treaties, identifying which ones contained payment terms and whether those terms had been fulfilled. What they found was disturbing. Out of 374 treaties ratified between 1830 and 1871, at least 67 contained specific payment obligations that appeared to have been partially or completely unfulfilled. The potential liability was staggering. Congress responded with hearings in both the House and Senate, examining the implications of Judge Morales' decision and exploring legislative responses. Some members proposed establishing a commission to comprehensively review all treaty obligations and recommend settlement frameworks that could resolve claims without endless litigation. Others suggested legislation explicitly limiting the time frame for asserting treaty claims, effectively overriding Judge Morales' conclusion that treaties don't expire. Indigenous rights advocates testified passionately against any legislative efforts to avoid treaty obligations, arguing that Congress's proper role was appropriating funds to pay legitimate debts, not finding ways to escape responsibility. The hearings were contentious, reflecting deep disagreements about how to balance historical justice with contemporary property stability. No clear consensus emerged, leaving resolution to the courts. For Jacob, the period after the trial verdict brought unexpected challenges alongside vindication. He received hundreds of media requests, speaking invitations and messages from people across the country and around the world who had followed the case. Some were supportive, thanking him for standing up for principle and bringing attention to treaty violations. Others were hostile, accusing him of greed, of trying to steal land that rightfully belonged to the public, of living in the past instead of accepting modern arrangements. The attention was overwhelming for someone who had spent his life as a relatively private rancher. His daily routine was disrupted by constant phone calls, unexpected visitors, and even occasional protesters showing up at his gate. The stress took a toll, and Jacob began to understand why his father and grandfather had been so cautious about making their case public. The county's response to the verdict was particularly bitter. County commissioners passed a resolution condemning Judge Morales' decision as judicial overreach and pledging to support the federal government's appeal. They claimed the ruling would devastate county finances by removing valuable property from the tax rolls and potentially triggering refund claims for taxes Jacob's family had paid over the years under protest. Local newspapers published editorials questioning whether Jacob, who had grown up partly on the reservation and attended public schools, truly represented indigenous interests or was simply an opportunist exploiting his ancestry for financial gain. The attacks were personal and often ugly, revealing underlying racial tensions that had never fully disappeared from the region. Jacob endured them with the same quiet determination he had shown throughout the legal battle, knowing that truth and law were on his side regardless of local opinion. Despite the challenges, Jacob also experienced profound moments of connection and validation. Elders from the Assiniboine community held a traditional ceremony honoring his family's generations of resistance and document preservation. They presented him with a ceremonial staff that had belonged to Chief White Eagle, found in tribal museum collections and returned to the family in recognition of their vindication. Jacob's mother spoke at the ceremony, her voice breaking with emotion as she described her grandfather Samuel's determination to maintain the truth despite constant pressure to surrender. She said Samuel had told her as a child that someday people would listen, someday the documents would matter, someday justice would come. She had doubted him, thinking it was an old man's wishful thinking. Now she knew he had been right. The ceremony provided Jacob with renewed strength for the continuing legal battle ahead. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals hearing took place in San Francisco on March 12, 2026, nearly 2 years after Judge Morales' initial ruling. The three-judge panel, Chief Judge Catherine Martinez, Judge David Wong, and Judge Samuel Richardson, had reviewed extensive written briefs from both sides as well as numerous amicus briefs from interested organizations. The government's appeal argued primarily that Judge Morales had failed to apply the proper standard for treaty interpretation, that she had given insufficient weight to the practical consequences of her ruling, and that she had exceeded appropriate judicial authority by issuing such broad declaratory relief. Amanda's response brief methodically defended Judge Morales' legal analysis while emphasizing that courts existed precisely to enforce legal obligations even when doing so was inconvenient for powerful parties. The oral argument would give each side 30 minutes to present their case and respond to judicial questions. Deputy Solicitor General Thomas Chen argued for the government, facing immediate skeptical questioning from Judge Martinez. She pressed him on why the government believed it could simply ignore clear treaty payment obligations without consequence. Chen argued that the passage of time and the development of settled property arrangements created equitable defenses against enforcement, even if the original breach was clear. Judge Martinez wasn't buying it. She noted that the government's position essentially meant that successful cover-up and delay eliminated legal accountability, which seemed contrary to basic justice principles. Chen struggled to articulate a principled distinction between cases where time should bar enforcement and cases where it shouldn't. His presentation was competent but defensive, clearly aware he was arguing for a position that looked bad morally, even if it might have some legal support. Amanda's oral argument was confident and compelling. She walked the judges through the treaty language, the documented payment history, and the government's own admissions in the 1973 Indian Claims Commission report. She emphasized that this wasn't about ancient history. It was about a contract breach that continued to the present day. Every year the government failed to pay what it owed was a new violation. The Running Bear family had maintained their claim continuously, never abandoning their rights or acquiescing to governmental theft. When Judge Richardson asked about the implications for other potential claims, Amanda acknowledged that other families in similar situations might well have valid claims. But that wasn't an argument against Jacob's claim. It was evidence of how widespread governmental treaty violations had been. Courts couldn't refuse to provide remedies simply because the wrongdoing was extensive. The judge's questions during oral argument suggested a panel deeply engaged with the case's complexity but uncertain about how to resolve the tension between legal principle and practical consequences. Judge Wong asked both sides about potential limiting principles. Were there circumstances where time should bar treaty enforcement, and if so, what were they? Judge Richardson questioned whether Congress rather than courts should resolve these issues through comprehensive legislation. Judge Martinez focused on the specific facts of Jacob's case, seeming less concerned about broader implications than about doing justice for the family before the court. The hearing lasted 90 minutes, well beyond the scheduled hour, with active judicial engagement throughout. Legal observers left uncertain about the likely outcome, noting that any of several different results seemed possible depending on which considerations the panel weighted most heavily. 4 months later, on July 9, 2026, the Ninth Circuit issued its decision. In a 2-1 ruling, the panel affirmed Judge Morales' judgment. Chief Judge Martinez wrote the majority opinion, joined by Judge Wong, holding that the treaty language clearly made payment a condition of the land cession and that the government's breach was material and continuing. The opinion emphasized that treaty obligations were different from ordinary contracts. They were agreements between sovereigns with constitutional status, and courts had special responsibility to enforce them faithfully. The majority rejected the government's equitable defenses, noting that the Running Bear family had continuously maintained their claim and that the government couldn't benefit from its own wrongdoing. While the opinion acknowledged potential implications for other cases, it noted that each situation would require individual assessment based on specific facts and documents. The declaratory judgment was appropriate and necessary to establish clear legal principles. Judge Richardson dissented, arguing that the majority's decision failed to adequately consider the practical consequences of voiding land cessions based on payment failures from over a century ago. He wrote that while the government's breach was regrettable, settled expectations and changed circumstances required some limiting principles on treaty enforcement. He suggested that Congress was the proper venue for resolving these issues through comprehensive settlement legislation that could balance competing interests. His dissent was thoughtful and well-reasoned, raising legitimate concerns about the implications of the majority's approach. But it represented the minority position. The Ninth Circuit had upheld Judge Morales' ruling, and Jacob's victory was now at the appellate level. The government faced another decision: accept the ruling or seek Supreme Court review. The Department of Justice spent 6 weeks debating whether to petition the Supreme Court for certiorari. Arguments raged within the administration about the political, legal, and financial implications. Some officials urged accepting the Ninth Circuit's decision, arguing that continued appeals only generated negative publicity and delayed inevitable reckoning with treaty obligations. Others insisted the precedent was too dangerous to leave unchallenged, that Supreme Court review offered the only chance to establish limiting principles that could protect against cascading liability. Ultimately, the administration decided to file a certiorari petition, emphasizing the national importance of the issues and the conflict between the Ninth Circuit's approach and decisions from other circuits that had been more restrictive about enforcing old treaty claims. Whether the Supreme Court would accept the case remained uncertain. The court grants review in only about 1% of cases and tends to avoid highly politicized disputes without clear circuit splits. While waiting for the Supreme Court's decision on whether to hear the case, Jacob's life gradually found a new equilibrium. The intense media attention had diminished somewhat, and he could return to actually running his ranch rather than constantly dealing with legal matters. The $21 million judgment stayed pending final resolution, but Jacob had received significant income from speaking engagements, a book deal to tell his family's story, and a documentary film project following the case. He used some of these resources to improve ranch infrastructure, employ additional workers from the Assiniboine community, and establish a scholarship fund for indigenous students studying law or history. He was trying to ensure that his family's struggle produced lasting benefits beyond their individual case. The broader impact of the case continued rippling through American society and legal systems. Law schools added the Running Bear case to their curricula, using it to teach students about treaty interpretation, property rights, and the continuing legacy of colonialism. Indigenous communities organized conferences and workshops teaching families how to research their own treaty histories and document any potential claims. The federal government, recognizing it could no longer ignore these issues, proposed legislation to establish a treaty review commission with funding to settle legitimate claims through negotiated agreements rather than litigation. While indigenous advocates were skeptical about whether the commission would have sufficient independence and resources, Its creation represented acknowledgement that the status quo was untenable. Change was happening, slowly but unmistakably. On November 4, 2026, the Supreme Court announced it would not grant certiorari in the Running Bear case. The Ninth Circuit's decision would stand as final. Jacob had won completely. The county was ordered to immediately update its property records recognizing his ownership, and the federal government had 90 days to pay the $21 million judgment. The government also issued the formal apology Judge Morales had ordered, with the Secretary of Interior personally delivering it at a ceremony attended by Assiniboine tribal leaders and Running Bear family members. The apology acknowledged the government's breach of the Treaty of 1850, its failure to make required payments, and its subsequent efforts to obscure that breach. It was an extraordinary moment, unprecedented official acknowledgement of systematic treaty violation and governmental bad faith. For indigenous peoples who had heard countless empty promises over centuries, having the government actually admit wrongdoing was almost as significant as the monetary judgment. Jacob used part of his judgment money to create the White Eagle Treaty Protection Fund, a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping indigenous families research historical treaties and pursue legitimate claims. The organization employed historians, attorneys, and archivists who could provide expertise families often lacked. Within its first year, the fund assisted 47 different families in documenting potential treaty claims, 17 of which proceeded to litigation based on the precedent Jacob's case had established. Some of these cases settled quickly as government agencies recognized they couldn't defend against well-documented claims. Others remained in litigation, slowly working through court systems. But the landscape had fundamentally changed. Treaty obligations could no longer be ignored, and indigenous families had resources and precedent to enforce their rights. Jacob's great-great-grandfather's careful record-keeping and his family's generations of persistence had created something larger than their individual victory. The Running Bear Ranch continues operating today, still in family hands, still on the land Chief White Eagle negotiated to protect in 1850. Jacob raises cattle, mentors young indigenous ranchers, and occasionally gives talks about his family's history and the importance of preserving documentation and maintaining principle in the face of pressure. When asked if the long struggle was worth it, Jacob always responds the same way. It was never about the money or even the land. It was about proving that truth matters, that promises must be kept, and that justice delayed is not justice denied if people refuse to give up. His great-great-grandfather had faith that righteousness would eventually prevail. 4 generations later, that faith was vindicated. The treaty that a sheriff tried to ignore became the document that changed history, proving that sometimes the oldest pieces of paper are the most powerful. So, what would you do with $21 million and your family's land finally recognized after 5 generations of struggle? Let us know in the comments below. If this story of persistence and justice moved you, smash that like button, hit subscribe, and click the notification bell so you never miss another incredible discovery.